Give me the signal. Good evening. My name is Tim Pratt. I am the chair of the Shoreview Environmental Quality Committee, and it's our pleasure to have you join us this evening for our environmental speaker series. We're actually here in person in the City Council chambers for the first time in over 2 years. But don't get used to it, because actually next month will be just virtual. But we've got a great presentation for you this evening. But first, I want to mention one of the other big projects that we do is the Green Community Awards program. So that's where we recognize folks who put in shoreline buffers or replace turf grass with native plantings, put in solar panels, they put in geothermal heating cooling systems. So if you are interested, please go to the website and fill out the application online and submit it. You've got till June, so you may not be in the mood quite yet because of the weather, but it's going to warm up and the blossoms are going to come popping out of the ground. So please check that out. So tonight we've got a great presentation about the Metropolitan Mosquito Control District. And let me just read a little introduction here. Of course, it's called Minnesota Mosquitoes, What's Bugging You? And in Minnesota and around the world, mosquitoes are not only a nuisance, but are capable of spreading diseases. And we know that quite well here in Shoreview. A former council member, Larry Morissette, died of encephalitis back in 2008. Now, we don't know exactly how Larry contracted it, encephalitis, but one of the means of transmission is through mosquito bites. So it is something that we need to be aware of. And in this presentation, Alex Carlson from the Metropolitan Mosquito Control District is going to introduce some of the species found in our part of the country and explain how the district monitors for disease and controls mosquitoes, along with environmental precautions taken to keep Minnesotans healthy. Now, who is Alex, you say? Well, Alex Carlson is the public affairs manager of the Metropolitan Mosquito Control District, which is based in St. Paul, where he leads public outreach efforts. Now, and he's the one who wrote this bio, enjoys talking to everyone from elementary school students to elected officials about mosquitoes, ticks, and black flies. So a very specific skill set, which I'm sure ensures job security. But when not talking about bugs, he enjoys spending time outdoors with his wife and 2 kids. So please join me in welcoming Alex Carlson.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for that intro. And I'm honored to be the first in-person presentation in over 2 years. And I know we're here in April. We're not necessarily thinking about bugs yet, but they're coming, and that's what we're here for. So in this presentation today, I'm going to be covering a lot of ground, but I encourage people, if you're viewing this online and you want to share a question or a comment, use the chat feature on Zoom, and I'll be able to answer questions throughout. You don't have to hold your questions to the end, and I'll do my best to answer as we go. And I want to give credit in this presentation to some input that I got from our executive director, Dr. Stephen Manweiler, and Dr. Nancy Reed, who've both been with MMCD for a long time, and other MMCD staff member who provided input as well. There we go. So in today's presentation, I'm going to do an overview of who we are at MMCD, talk about mosquitoes in Minnesota, including their life cycle and habitats, some specific species, and then talking about diseases. Integrated pest management, what is that and why is that so important to us? I'll talk about some environmental precautions, specifically related to bees, butterflies, and other pollinators, some of the biggest concerns that people bring up to us, and talk about what we're doing to mitigate those risks. And then some of our maps, and I always like to end our presentations with mosquito control tips. The most common question that we get is, what can we do to prevent mosquitoes from overwhelming our yard or our business? And so I'll end up with some tips for both personal protection and homeowner guides. So MMCD has been around since 1958. We were established by a state statute, and we serve the 7 counties in the metro area. You can see on the map there. And our governance is the elected county commissioners. So each county has their elected representatives. They each serve a term on our board. So they're the final stamp for our budget. They oversee our operations, and they meet with us monthly to review everything that we're doing, which I think is a really good system because it's elected representatives that oversee our operations. So if people have major concerns or anything like that, they can talk to their elected officials. Our service area is 2,900 square miles. We serve over 3 million people. We're the land of 10,000 lakes and even more ponds and swamps and all that stuff. So we have 70,000 wetland habitats that we monitor, 30,000 woodland habitats, and we're funded by property taxes. We're considered a special taxing district. So when you get your property tax statement around this time of year, you see a little thing in there that says special taxing districts, and that's where we fall under. So Minnesota mosquitoes, they've been referred to as our state bird before lovingly, because we have a lot of mosquitoes in Minnesota. There's actually 3,000 species of mosquitoes worldwide. Here in Minnesota, the kinds that can survive our climate, we have about 52 species that are established here and we find recurring year after year. Only about 15 of those species, though, are what we consider species of concern, meaning they're human biting species or they're a public health risk because they can potentially carry diseases. So if you think about that, that's most of the mosquitoes that we have here aren't ones that were a primary concern for us. Mosquitoes bite a lot of people or a lot of species besides humans. There's certain mosquitoes that only bite birds, only bite frogs or other species. So we really focus on the ones that are a risk to humans. To really understand mosquito control, it helps to understand the mosquito life cycle. So this image kind of just shows the steps. I always compare it when I talk to elementary school students. I say the mosquitoes are like a caterpillar, maybe not as beautiful when they emerge from their cocoon, but they start with the egg, and then the egg hatches in the water and becomes the larva, which is like the caterpillar, where they're feeding on a lot of different things. And then they become the pupa, which is like the cocoon or chrysalis. They're no longer feeding, and that's where they're developing their wings and legs and stuff like that. And then they emerge as the adult mosquito. That's similar to the butterfly stage. Although I think people like butterflies and mosquitoes not so much. So kind of going into more detail about those, the way that the mosquitoes in Minnesota work, there's a lot of different species that have a slightly different life cycle, but it's pretty much an overall theme emerges. The eggs are either laid individually on soil near water, which are species that fall into the 80s categorization, or they're in rafts directly on standing water, which is the Culex species of mosquitoes. So mosquitoes have biological sensors where they can detect where water is going to be. They're heavily reliant on standing water. So the most common species we have, they'll lay their eggs right on the edges of a pond or a swamp. And that's where, when the rain comes in, it washes the eggs into the water, and that's where they hatch, and then the larva emerges. The eggs can actually survive unhatched for up to 7 years, which is kind of mind-blowing. We get this question a lot. Last year was a really dry year. The big story of 2021 was there wasn't a lot of mosquitoes because there wasn't a lot of rain. And so people are like, well, does that mean it's a good thing for 2022? But not necessarily, because those eggs are still there. If we have a rainy year this year or in the next couple of years, they'll be right back to where we were. After the eggs, the larvae emerge. There's 4 different stages of larvae called instars. So they get a little bit bigger, they shed their exoskeleton, and they emerge to a different size. They're filter feeders. They feed on bacteria, yeast, algae. The larva stage is usually 4 days to 14 days, really dependent on the water temperature. So early this time of year, we're already starting to find larvae, but the larvae we're finding now aren't going to emerge for another month or so, because the water temperature is too cold. It slows down everything. In July, when the water temperature is warm, they'll only be in the larva stage for 4 or 5 days. Then the pupa, which is the tumblers, they're called, because they still kind of tumble around near the surface of the water. At this stage, they're no longer feeding. They're developing their adult mosquito parts. This stage is about 1 to 2 days. And then they emerge from the water as adult mosquitoes. In the case of the female mosquitoes, they go seeking a blood meal, which they need the blood in order to reproduce. And then the males go in search of flower nectar and other sources of sugar just to survive. Females can live 2 to 3 months. They can live all summer long. Males typically live only about 15 to 30 days. Like I said, there's 52 species in Minnesota. I don't have time to go into all of them in details, but there's a couple that are really important, I think, to know about if you want to really understand what's bugging you, as the title of this presentation says. The most common mosquito we have is the summer floodwater mosquito, or the Aedes vexans. It's a rainwater mosquito. So when the rain comes, their eggs hatch. They're in the water for a couple days and then they emerge. So that's why we always see the most high mosquito activity, about a week or so after a heavy rainfall. They lay their eggs next to the water, and we see a lot of these. Usually when you're swatting mosquitoes, it's probably a summer floodwater mosquito. Culex mosquitoes aren't quite as common, but they're the species that we're most concerned with because they're the primary vector of West Nile virus in Minnesota, which is the most common mosquito-borne disease. This is a fun one to say, Cochleatidia perturbans. The cattail mosquito, it took me about 2 years working at MMCD to spell that right on the first try. But the cattail mosquito is a really unique species that we have here because they actually only emerge once per year, right around the 4th of July. They lay their eggs in the fall, they hatch right before winter, and then they attach to the root of cattails, where they get their name from, and then they overwinter as larvae, and then they emerge next 4th of July. So usually when we see a big surge of mosquitoes around the 4th of July, a lot of those will be cattail mosquitoes. These are a little bit bigger mosquitoes, and they're very aggressive human biting mosquitoes. So that's why 4th of July picnics can get swarmed so easily. And then the final one that I want to mention is the Aedes triceriatus, or the tree hole mosquito. It's a container breeding mosquito, and the reason this one's of concern to us is it potentially can carry lacrosse encephalitis, another mosquito-borne disease. It gets its name, as you can probably guess, because it enjoys warm, dark areas like tree holes, waste tires, stuff like that is where that typically reproduces. This is one of my favorite slides. Let's do some mosquito math. Now that you kind of have the basics, let's take one mosquito who gets the blood meal, has 300 eggs, and then 150 of those are female. Second generation comes along, those 150 females plus the mom who's still around lay 151 egg rafts, 300 eggs, 45,300 mosquitoes, half of those are females. So look at that third generation, 22,650 times 300, 6,795,000 mosquitoes. You see where this is going. Fourth generation, 3.5 million mosquitoes times 300, you're at 1.3 billion mosquitoes, all from one female mosquito, all in less than a month from the reproduction cycle. Obviously, not all the mosquitoes survive and not all the eggs will hatch, but just kind of goes to show you, if given the right conditions, mosquitoes really can flourish. And so we really do have our work cut out for us. It doesn't take a long time for mosquitoes to really kind of overwhelm an environment. So we do our best to keep the population in check and make areas where a lot of human population are livable. So the mosquito habitat, there's a variety of different habitats, but the main thing that mosquitoes need are standing water, shallow standing water. So we have a lot of lakes, but lakes aren't really the primary mosquito habitat because they're big. The water's not shallow. There's predators and stuff like that that'll eat the mosquito. We see a lot more mosquito reproduction in ponds and swamps, or if you look at that top picture of a lake, the edges of the lake where there's kind of protected from the wind, it's shallower. That's where you'll see mosquito production. So there's permanent water sites, those areas that hold water pretty much year round, even in dry years. Then you have the floodwater sites. Those are the areas that are designed to flood after the rain. A lot of cities, they design runoffs to get the water away from housing areas and communities, but then it has to go somewhere. And so we monitor the area where the water runs off to. And then we create a lot of mosquito habitat with our garbage and with our lifestyles. So tree holes, containers, anything that we leave out, waste tires, buckets, bird baths, stuff like that. And catch basins on the side of the road can be a big mosquito habitat. Those are designed to catch debris that's going down the sewer system, but by design, they also have a lot of water that just sits there all summer long. So we do a lot of monitoring those types of habitats and just education to encourage people, don't leave water out in your yard. Make sure you check your yard after a rainfall to make sure that it's not collecting things, because we've found mosquito larvae in a bottle cap that's been filled with water. Really, they don't need a lot, especially in a dry year like last year when there's not a lot of other water sources. They'll find any water and reproduce. So make sure you're checking, clearing gutters, stuff like that. So the real reason for mosquito control, obviously we want to make communities livable and not be overwhelmed by mosquitoes, but our main charge, the first part of our mission statement, is to protect people from mosquito-borne disease, because mosquitoes are actually the deadliest creatures on Earth. I don't think there are any horror movies about mosquitoes. There's lots about sharks and snakes and stuff like that, but really mosquitoes are what people should be scared of, because mosquitoes kill more human beings than any other species on Earth. There's a really cool book for any history buffs called The Mosquito, A Human History of Our Deadliest Predator by historian Timothy Weingard. And he basically goes through several major world conflicts and looks at the roles that mosquitoes played in basically changing world history. Just an example, Alexander the Great, historians believe, was killed by malaria. Just imagine how different the world map would look if it wouldn't have been for mosquitoes and taking down one of the great conquerors. So fun reading if anybody's interested in that. But worldwide, the diseases that are of concern, malaria is the big one, dengue fever, yellow fever, and to a lesser extent recently Zika, but that was the big story in 2016. Here in Minnesota, we have West Nile virus, Jamestown Canyon virus, Eastern equine encephalitis, or triple E, lacrosse encephalitis, and dog heartworm. There's a couple others that are even more rare, but those are kind of the ones that we are concerned with at MMCD. So I'm going to go into some of the diseases a little bit more specifically, just to kind of give some general information. But by far the most common mosquito-borne disease is West Nile virus. The Culex mosquito is the most likely vector of this. It's a species that mainly feeds on birds, but also does feed on human beings and horses from time to time. And that's how the disease is spread. So if you look on the bottom right there, there's kind of an image of the West Nile transmission cycle. It's mosquitoes to birds. Some birds can carry West Nile virus without being impacted. Other birds have a high mortality rate, especially corvids, ravens, blue jays, and crows. So a lot of times a flock of dead crows in an area is a symptom that there's West Nile activity in the area, and we need to make sure that we're being cautious. It's a disease that can't be spread. We're a dead end host, so it can't be spread from person to person. You can only get it from an infected mosquito, but it's a disease that we're concerned about. 2018 was kind of the last year where there was widespread West Nile virus. There's a map from the CDC where you can kind of see the differences. 2021, there was fewer cases, but it was still present in the Twin Cities. Couple cases right here in the metro that we're monitoring. Fortunately, there were no deaths in 2021 from West Nile virus, but you can see North Dakota and South Dakota have a lot of cases. They just have really good habitat for Culex mosquitoes in those areas. So that's why they see so many cases. Lacrosse encephalitis is a disease that affects children primarily. It's a disease that can be spread. Usually the lacrosse encephalitis mosquito doesn't fly very far from its hatch site. So usually we can control this disease by removing habitat where they could potentially reproduce. So this is the tree hole mosquito that I mentioned earlier that spreads this disease. So they're commonly found in tree holes and waste tires. Small mammals are the vertebrate hosts, chipmunks and squirrels. And then same thing, humans are the dead end host. This is a transovarial disease, meaning that when the mosquitoes lay the eggs, those mosquitoes that hatch are also carrying the disease. Whereas West Nile mosquitoes can only get it from biting an infected bird. These ones, the eggs can hatch carrying the disease. So we go try to eliminate any habitat in areas where lacrosse is found. It's pretty rare. There hasn't been a lacrosse case in the past couple of years, but it can be very harmful if it does impact children. One of the diseases that's kind of the new kid on the block in a sense, Eastern equine encephalitis, or triple E. There's never been a human case in Minnesota, but it's something that we're monitoring very closely because it's such a dangerous disease. It's extremely rare, and it typically affects horses, but there's a 30% mortality rate in humans and 90% in horses. There's a vaccine available for horses, so people who own horses are encouraged to get their horses vaccinated. There's no vaccine available for humans. In 2019, there were 39 human cases, mainly in Michigan and Connecticut, where they had big outbreaks. And it was really a kind of a dangerous situation. The vector species is the Culicida melanura. And this one, they say there's a bridge species, meaning it's not the melanura mosquito that's biting people. It's the cattail mosquito is, they believe the culprit was in those two outbreaks. The cattail mosquito bit the same host that the melanura mosquito bit and then bit a person, and that's how it was spread. There were positive horse cases of Eastern equine encephalitis in 2 northern Minnesota counties last year. And so that's why this is a concern for us. There hasn't been any human cases, but there have been horse cases in Minnesota. So we know that there's disease activity in our area. Other diseases that we look out for, Jamestown Canyon. It's a spread by a spring mosquito species. There was 23 human cases in 2019, no reported in 2020. I believe there were a few in 2021, but not many. It's another type of encephalitis. It can be harmful for people with pre-existing conditions, but it's not very common. And the dog heartworm. A lot of people don't know that heartworm is actually a mosquito-borne disease. So get your pets vaccinated and make sure you're taking precautions to protect them. All right. So now we know why mosquitoes are something that we need to be concerned about and why we do mosquito control. So now I'm going to talk about our approach to mosquito control at MMCD. So we practice what's called integrated pest management. Mosquito control agencies across the country have embraced integrated pest management, or also known as integrated mosquito management. But it basically means that mosquito control decisions should be driven by surveillance and monitoring, so that there's a lot of steps that are being done, and then you want to control mosquitoes in the least toxic way possible. So you're the most effective way with the least toxic way possible. And so this is a visual that we made to kind of show the steps of IPM, or integrated pest management. We do we plan, monitor, identify, control, evaluate, and then educate. And that's kind of the order that we go to, starting with planning, working our way kind of around the hexagons there. But we also have a technical advisory board, a TAB review committee that reviews our practices annually. And so this is made up of representatives from the U of M, various state agencies like the Department of Health, the DNR, as well as state agencies like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the EPA. They review all that we do in a meeting over the course of the month of February. We present a large report to them, and they kind of look at what we're doing, and they also examine us against other mosquito control agencies to make sure that we're still doing the best methods possible. And they kind of make sure that they're looking at our operations from a scientific lens. Our full TAB report is available on our website if anybody's interested in really getting into the science behind it. It's got some pretty cool stuff. All right, so I'm kind of going to work my way around the steps of IPM. So step one is the surveillance. Good mosquito control is surveillance driven. Usually when people see us out in their community, if they see people with a mosquito control vests on or see our trucks driving around, usually they're out doing surveillance. That's most of what we do, is figuring out what's out there before we figure out how to respond to it. So we have our field staff go out and they put on the waders and they go out into ponds and wetlands and they check for the presence of larvae. So usually our biggest activity period is right after a heavy rainfall, usually about an inch of rain or more. That can trigger a brood hatch. So then we send our crews out to the site that we know are rainwater sites where there's probably going to be larvae. They can check the larvae. They use a long-handled dipper. They'll get a count for how many larvae they find in a site by taking a small sample and then estimating based on the size of the site. And then they'll also get a vial sample that they send back to our lab in St. Paul. We also use mosquito traps and sweep net collections to collect adult mosquitoes. This is something that I get to do, which is really fun. Every Monday night in the summer months, I get to stand in my front yard with a net and I wait for a minute for the mosquitoes to come by me. And then I sweep over my head and around me for 2.5 minutes and try to catch all the mosquitoes I can. And then I put it in my freezer and bring it to the lab the next day. It's for science. I look weird to my neighbors, but it's getting good data. But then we also set up traps around the Twin Cities. There on the bottom left is one of our CO2 traps. It has a small amount of dry ice in it, so it mimics the CO2 that a person gives off when they're breathing, and that's how it attracts mosquitoes. And then there's a fan attached to it, and it sucks all the mosquitoes and pulls them into that net. So we set those out every Monday night, about 200 total traps around the Twin Cities to really give us kind of a snapshot of that moment in time. What does the mosquito situation look like? And we post these on our website, so you can kind of see from week to week, what's currently going on with mosquitoes. So once we get those collections, we bring them back to our lab in St. Paul. So we have an entomology lab overseen by our technical services department, which is run by entomologists. They work with the field staff to identify the samples that are brought in. The larval samples, when those are brought in, they're identified to determine if they're a species that merits treatment. Like I said at the beginning, not every species is one that's going to be a human biting species. So they can check the larva to ensure that they're a species that merits a treatment. And then also in instances where there's a lot of mosquito production, we can identify by species to focus on the disease vectors first and make sure that's our top priority. The adult mosquito samples are sent to identify by species for the sake of our maps, but then we also have a vector ecologist on staff who will take some samples if they're species that we know can carry diseases, and he can actually test them in our lab at St. Paul for the presence of West Nile. So we usually know by collecting mosquitoes and testing them before any human cases are found, we usually know if there's West Nile activity in a certain area. So we can say, this trap in Shoreview collected a mosquito that tested positive, so we can make sure that we're responding appropriately. Here's what our maps look like. These are the maps that are published. I don't know if you can see that well, but these are also on our website. We put out a map every week to kind of give a snapshot of what the mosquito situation is currently. So you can see that's the entire 7-county metro area. All the dots and squares and stuff like that represent a count. I compared 2020 versus 2021. 2020 was a pretty typical year in terms of precipitation. You can see there's a lot of red squares, meaning they had more than 1,000 mosquitoes in those traps. All the red basically means they had more than 300 mosquitoes at a certain trap, which is pretty common for mid-July. 2020 was extremely unusual year. There's one red square kind of in the middle of Hennepin County, but everywhere else has a lot of blue dots with under 100 mosquitoes, which is very rare for July 12th. when that was collected. It was just because they're so rain dependent and we just didn't get a lot of rain last year. So it allowed us to focus on other things while we're doing our day-to-day work. So these are prepared by our entomology lab. Our entomologist, Dr. Scott Larson, is kind of the one that distributes these, and he's the one that really is kind of the mastermind behind these. So once we figure out what's out there, we got to figure out how to control them. Once we determine that control is necessary, we go to some decisions about what type of control is going to be used. The three primary methods that we use are larval control, adult mosquito control, and habitat reduction, or reducing breeding sites. And a lot of the last one, habitat reduction, just comes down to education, just telling people, remove the standing water from your yard. It's probably the biggest thing that I'm saying when people ask me, you know, what's the one thing I can do for mosquitoes? It's just get rid of the standing water. Or if you have standing water you can't get rid of, make sure you're treating it or disrupting it in some way. We consider ourselves a larval control agency, though, when it comes to control materials. We do vastly more larval control than we do adult control. On the bottom right is a map or a grid from our technical advisory board report from just this past year. So you can kind of see 2016 was an extremely unusual year. It was a very, very wet year. We were way higher precipitation. We went way over our typical material allotment. So that wasn't a typical year, but you can see the years following that when it kind of got back to normal. 2020 and 2021, we only did a few thousand acres of adult control, or we did almost 200,000 acres of larval control. So we do a lot more larval control than we do adult control. There's a couple of reasons for that. One, it's a lot easier to control mosquito larvae because they're all in one place. They're in a pond or they're in a swamp where they're all there together, and we can figure out exactly how many there are and get a rough estimate for how much materials we need. Versus the adult mosquitoes, which can be flying around in woodlands and in people's yards and kind of everywhere. The other thing is the larval control materials that we have are by far the safest options on the market. They're specifically designed to not target anything except for mosquito larvae. So fish can eat them and everything else can eat them, and it's not going to have a harmful impact. The main material we use, and I'll talk about those in the next slide, is specifically targeted for mosquito larvae, black fly larvae, and fungus gnats. So those are the only species that are impacted by it. And then also we have the geographical advantage because we have such a large service area. We get a lot of calls from other cities and stuff like that that says, you're so effective with larval control, what can we do to mimic that? And if you're just one city kind of by yourself, you're not going to have as much effect with larval control because the adult mosquitoes from the neighboring cities are going to fly in. Mosquitoes, they don't know city borders. They'll just go wherever the people are. But because we have such a wide geography, we can really target our larval control and then have a widespread impact with the least amount of effort. So that's the main reason why we focus so heavily on larval control. But we do some adult control. I'll talk about that too as we get there. But the first thing, source reduction, it's the easiest thing for people to do. We do alley inspections or neighborhood inspections to kind of check to see if there's a lot of standing water in an area. Sometimes we have to do property notices if people have a lot of debris that's clearly collecting water. And then we also do public education campaigns. In the bottom left, there's some waste tires. And I think I'm going to plug this on a later slide too, but I'll mention it now. We do free tire collections at MMCD. So anybody who's in the county service area will come and collect your waste tires for residents at no charge. So you just give us a call, let us know how many tires you have. They have to be off the rims and they have to be typically truck sized, but we'll come and do that. It's a good way to reduce mosquito habitat in the community. Larval control. So our larval control material looks like that in the palm of that guy's hand in the top right there. It's a dry material, dry granules that are applied directly to standing water. We apply it through helicopter, backpack, which is the picture there on the bottom, or a hand spreader where people just toss it out for really small sites. But larval control materials are specific to mosquito larvae. They're not toxic to any other species. The primary active ingredients that we use are BTI is the biggest one. It's been around since the 70s, and there's been no documented incidents of resistance. So even though it's been used for so often, it still is very effective. And it's the best to use for the floodwater mosquitoes that come out right after rain. We also use methoprene and spinosad, which are considered insect growth inhibitors. These are kind of cool because the way that they work is they basically just stop a mosquito's development when they're in the larval stage. Doesn't kill them right away. It just stops them so they never become adult mosquitoes. So they can still be eaten by predators or anything like that. Basically, they'll just die as larvae and they'll never become adult mosquitoes. So it's another kind of product that we use in some capacity as well. So a lot of times people see our helicopters out and they're like, what are those helicopters doing? They're dropping pellets into the water. So if you see it fly over a house or something like that, you don't have to worry. There's nothing that's you can get in contact with. They swoop down over the ponds, and we contract with a helicopter company that's very well trained, and they know what they're doing, and they do a good job of getting it right where it needs to go. Adult control is primarily used to control disease mosquitoes. So like I said, we usually know when West Nile activity is happening before any human cases are found. And so usually we'll respond to West Nile positive mosquitoes with some adult control to make sure that citizens in a certain area are being kept safe from the risks of mosquito-borne disease. The mosquito or adult control material we use are synthetic pyrethroids, permethrin, sumethrin, or resmethrin are some of the ones. They're applied to barrier vegetation via backpack. A lot of people, when they think of mosquito control, they have a vision of like the 60s when the trucks would drive down and just kind of have the fogs behind them. That's called cold fogging. That's really not done anymore. We do it occasionally from an ATV in an area, but it's not really what it used to be. Usually now it's applied directly to vegetation from a backpack. And the reason that is because we can train our staff then what to spray and what not to spray to make sure that they're avoiding any pollinator plants, flowering weeds, anything like that that could potentially pose a risk to non-target species. What they do is they spray the barrier of a wooded area, because mosquitoes during the day when it's hot and sunny out, they go into the shaded area, and then in the evening they come out and they land right on the edge of a wooded area, and that's when they use their sensors to detect where people are. So that's when they'll get in contact with our materials, and that's when they're most effective. So we use a very small amount. And I always put this on there. We've never done aerial applications of adulticides or of adult control materials. Other states do and other places do, but we've never done that here in Minnesota, and we have no intentions to do that. But a lot of times we get that question, I see your helicopters, I see, I see stuff with your signs on it. What are you spraying? And it's like, I always want to reiterate to people, we're not spraying anything. We're dropping dry things. If you got in contact with a material, you'd see it, you'd be able to pick it up. That's the only thing that we apply from helicopters. We do a lot of public education, informing the public about how they can protect themselves against mosquitoes, but also all aspects of mosquito control. We attend a lot of events, career fairs, stuff like that. I was just at an elementary school today talking to students, try to get the word out there to people about what's in their community that need to be aware of. Pollinator protection is part of our educational outreach. So we connect with different organizations that have that as a chief concern. And our outreach includes community events. We do a lot of social media. We do presentations at school. And then here I am doing public speaking. All right, so environmental precautions. We are very concerned about the environment, just like everybody else. We want to make sure that anything that we're doing is not having a harmful impact. So we take a lot of steps to ensure environmental safety. First of all of our staff are certified by the MDA, the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, and their licenses are renewed every 2 years. We do annual training and reminders on pollinator safety, how to identify habitat, make sure that we're following material labels. We do outreach in collaboration with groups like the Minnesota Hobby Beekeepers Association. Great group to work with, and they really understand, they're insect people too, so they really know kind of the intricacies of what that entails. And then we use the lowest effective treatment dosage of the least toxic effective control materials available for both larval and adult control. Obviously, make our decisions based on research, data, and expert guidance. That's what our TAB members are for, giving us kind of that expert guidance. So in the next couple slides, I kind of prepared some explanations of what we did in terms of environmental precautions. What's cool about our agency is because we've been around for so long, we have a lot of data. And a lot of that data can be used for scientific studies. And sometimes we've gotten grants and stuff like that to do our own studies to kind of check to see what impacts that we're having on our communities to make sure that we're being as safe as possible. So first of all, Drift Watch is an organization with the Minnesota Department of Agriculture so that we can map out where hives are, where organic farms are and stuff like that. Make sure that there's no bee lethal pesticides being used in those areas. We just receive alerts whenever new sites are added and integrate them into our mapping software. We have a really cool mapping system of our own that we developed over the years where when our field people are out and they need to check on a site, they can pull it up and immediately see, there's hives a certain amount away from that or anything like that. Most of the materials I said that we use have no impact on beehives. They're not harmful to pollinators. So, but if we ever have to do adult control in a certain area, then we know what's around. The rusty patched bumblebee. We did a study reviewing the risks of ARC materials with the rusty patched bumblebee, because the rusty patched bumblebee was placed on the endangered species list by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So in 2018, we partnered with the Fish and Wildlife Service to get advice and evaluate potential impact of mosquito control operations on the rusty patched bumblebee. And so we overlaid basically all of our adult mosquito control treatments with known habitat for the rusty patched bumblebee to kind of take a look at where our treatments likely to happen versus where their habitat is. And we're glad to hear their conclusion was that the risk of our treatments to the rusty patched bumblebee is low. There wasn't a lot of overlap between their habitat and their potential habitat and where we go. The full study can be found on our website, mmcd.org/publications. Monarchs. There's a lot of concern from people about monarchs. People love butterflies. We love butterflies. And so we did a similar study as the rusty patched bumblebee, where we monitored what risk is there for drift for pyrethroid treatments on the milkweed habitat. And so we did a spatial overlap, looking at where treatments are done or where they could potentially be done, and how far we have to be from milkweed specifically to make sure that there's no drift that gets on the milkweed. It really just helped us know. We can track where milkweed is, where there's pollinator habitat, and make sure that we're giving a certain amount of swath width to make sure that we're not having any risk. This is just to minimize the chance that we're going to harm any pollinators as much as possible. I mean, most of the materials that we use, we know don't pose a risk to pollinators, but we want to make sure if we have to do adult control for the sake of public health, we want to make sure that we're still being as safe as possible. So we conducted this study. Again, the full outline of the study can be found on our website. And then this is our biggest study, which I think this is a really fascinating one. So basically what we did is we wanted to see what impact our larval control materials were having in a Minnesota climate, in a Minnesota environment, on species that aren't mosquitoes. So what we did is we went to Wright County, which is a county that we don't do any services in. And they found 10 mosquito habitats that they didn't treat and 10 that they did treat. And we worked with the University of Minnesota and had students and professors and stuff like that kind of do a count of what the species were in that area, and then reserve it over it says an 8-year study, but it actually was added 2 more years after that. The full study is a 10-year study. Over 10 years, what was the impact on the site that was treated versus the site that wasn't treated? And this is primarily with larval control materials on birds, frogs, non-target insect species. The full study, it's very detailed. It can be found on our website. But we were very glad to find that larval control materials made no impact on bird populations, no impact on frog populations. The only thing it really impacted was mosquitoes. And so we felt confident that what we're doing is safe to be putting out in the environment, and having because we get a lot of questions about, like, if you're eliminating mosquitoes or reducing mosquitoes, is that going to affect the food chain? And so that's really what we were trying to see. There's no species whose primary food source is mosquitoes. There are species that feed on mosquitoes, but we wanted to see, if there would be an impact. And so that was what this study was all about. All right, check them out. Looks like I'm good on time. So got a couple slides left, but this is a really good resource for people. We put a lot of information on our website, but one thing that residents can do is check to see what sites we're monitoring around your neighborhood. We have a map site where you can enter in your address, and then it might be a little hard to see on here, but all the little areas that are outlined in orange are sites that we're monitoring. So you can see there's a big lake there. We're not really monitoring the lake because that's not going to grow mosquitoes. It's these little tiny, indentations where water sits for a couple days at a time or weeks at a time, or small ponds and swamps and stuff like that. But you can click on those, and a little box will pop up at the bottom that'll say what type of site it is, what the risk is, and then you can click on site info, and it'll tell you every time that we've been there in the past. I think it goes back about 14 years. It'll say when we've been there, what we found, if any treatment was done, what was used. It'll tell you if any mosquitoes that could potentially carry West Nile virus were found there. It's just a really cool resource. A lot of times people will say, I've got a pond near me. I'm not sure. I think it's growing a lot of mosquitoes. Can you come check it? And I'll direct them here and say, well, see if we've been there. And chances are we've been there within the past couple of months. A lot of times people think that they have an idea of where mosquitoes are coming from, but it's not necessarily that site. So it's just good for people to kind of click around and see, and you'll be surprised how many places right around your house we're monitoring. So we're pretty busy. People in the community can sign up for email alerts. So if you want to know more about when we'll potentially be in your neighborhood, we have a system to alert whenever this is specifically for adult control. We also post on our website whenever we're doing helicopter treatments. So it's just right at the bottom of our website. There's a button that says subscribe for alerts. You can also get alerts if you want to find out about when we're post job applications or when you just want to have receive our general newsletter. And if anybody's looking for summer work, we're still hiring for some summer seasonal opportunities. But that's all on our website. You can sign up for alerts and get notified about when we're doing adult mosquito control activities. We do a lot of outreach. So public education is a really important part of our IPM program. We think we consider all of our staff to be part of the education program. So we make sure that they have business cards and stuff and are able to answer questions. And we also do a lot of outreach to groups. So I always try to put a plug in. If you know a group that you think we should connect with or we should speak to, let us know. Or if you have a public event that we should attend to help get the word out in the community, let us know. And we'd love to be connected with that. All right. So the tips, my ultimate tips on how to protect yourself from mosquitoes. So there's two kind of sections here to protect yourself as an individual and then how to protect your yard. We put together a great resource on our website called the Residence Guide. So if you go to mmcd.org and you click Residence Guide, there's a lot of tips. I think there's like 25 tips between personal protection and how to protect yourself, but just kind of want to hit on the big ones. To protect yourself, the easiest way to avoid mosquitoes is to make sure that you're doing personal protective measures. Wearing bug spray, EPA registered insect repellent is the best. We recommend something with DEET. There's other natural repellents that have been approved by the EPA that are good. Picaridin or oil of lemon eucalyptus are both recommended as well. But we always just say whatever works for you, great. Just make sure that you use it. And the thing that I was really trying to drive home to people last year we didn't have a lot of annoyance mosquitoes, but we did have West Nile virus activity, even in a low mosquito year. And so even if you're not feeling yourself getting bit a lot, it's still a good idea if you're going to be out around peak mosquito hours, in the evening hours, put some repellent on just to be extra safe. They're more attracted to dark colors. So long sleeves, loose fitting, light colored clothing is going to offer more protection. This is one tip that I give to people. Always say, like, what's your one mosquito tip that people don't know about as much? This is a really good tip for people. Use a permethrin-based repellent for your clothes and gear. So you can buy these at the store. It'll say like clothes and gear spray, and the active ingredient is permethrin. Spray your pants and your shoes and your socks, and then spray your gear as well, because not only will that repel mosquitoes, but it also will repel ticks. So when you're out hiking or camping or something like that, it's going to be really effective, and it can make it through like 2 or 3 washes as well, and your clothes will still repel them. So it works really well. Since I've started doing that when I go camping, I haven't found any ticks on me, which has been nice. And then avoid outdoors during their peak feeding time. They're most active right around sunset. So if you can, go inside during that time and come back out later when they've had their fill, or just stay in those times of day. It's going to be best for you, or just put up some sort of barrier, go into a screened in area or something like that during those times. Ways to protect your home: remove containers, clear gutters. I've mentioned this, and it's the biggest thing that I try to drive home to people is just get rid of the standing water. That's one of the best ways that you can control mosquitoes. We've gotten calls from people saying, mosquitoes are horrible in my neighborhood and there's no ponds or anything around me. I don't know what's going on. And it's probably because there's somebody who's got a bunch of materials in their yard that are holding water, and that's where the mosquitoes are coming from. So get rid of the standing water, and it makes a big difference. Waste tires, we'll remove those for free. Keep grass and shrubs short. They like to kind of hide away from the sun during the day, so that'll help. Ensure that there's no holes in screens. This is another one of my favorite tips that I find really effective. If you have an outdoor seating area, set up a fan in the area, especially on those hot summer nights when it's really hot out anyway, because that does, one, mosquitoes are weak flyers, so it can kind of push them away, but also it'll disperse your scent, because the thing they're most attracted to you is your scent and your body heat. So it kind of tampers down on your scents that you're giving off. So that can really help. If you're considering hiring a professional to help with mosquito control, we highly recommend that you call a certified pesticide applicator from the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. If you go to our website, we link right to the Minnesota Department of Agriculture's list, where you can type in your county and it'll say who's certified in your area. It's kind of hard to get there if you go through the MDA website. So if you go to our website, we link you right to where you can find it. But if you do have a really bad problem with mosquitoes, you're like, I need to call somebody who's a certified pesticide applicator, because they're trained to make sure that they're avoiding, pollinator habitat, and make sure that they're using the least toxic materials in the safest way possible. So that's another recommendation. All right. I'm a little bit done early, but I haven't seen anything come through in the chat. But if people are tuning into this after the fact, this is my contact information, my email address, and my phone number. That's my direct line. You can also call our front desk as well. Information's all on our website.
All right. Yeah. So for folks at home, please type a question in the chat box. And while you're doing that, we've actually planted Maria with some questions. So Maria, it's
So I've got lots of questions because I'm just curious as well. But so you've mentioned a couple of times now what mosquitoes are attracted to, including our scents, dark clothing, carbon dioxide. Is there anything, I guess, really specific that like really does attract them to us? Like what about, or is it just pheromones? Is it something? I guess I'm just really curious because we always kind of hear the myth of, oh, it's a certain blood type. Is that just a myth there? Is it actually something to do with?
So that's a good, there was a study that found that they are attracted to O positive blood types slightly more, but that's not going to be the main thing. The main thing they're attracted to is scents. So a sense and body heat. So if somebody runs a little warmer, if you ever know anybody who's pregnant women are mosquito magnets because they tend to run a little bit warmer. If you're using artificial scents like hairsprays and perfumes that can give a lot of smells off, they'll be more attracted to that. And then some people are just genetically unlucky. And I know that's like, I've got 2 kids and one of them seems to get 1,000 mosquito bites. The other one will get 1, and you can guess which one complains more. But it's just kind of unluckiness. But yeah, it's mainly scents and temperature that they're attracted to.
I'm definitely one of those unlucky people. So I was really just curious. You hear that, but I never knew if it was actually true. So another question, you mentioned towards the beginning during the mosquito life cycle that male adult mosquitoes will feed on nectar and flowers. Are they considered pollinators, or do they do any cross-pollination to help with things during the spring?
They are, well, both female mosquitoes and male mosquitoes feed on flower nectar. So they are considered pollinators, but not significant pollinators. So they're not like going to do a lot of the work that the main pollinators we think of, the bees and butterflies and stuff like that, doing. They do a very minute amount compared to them.
And you mentioned a few research projects that you guys have done. Is there any plan to continue those projects, or have you kind of gotten a sense of, we're really not, our treatments aren't impacting anything that we're researching, so kind of closing that off? I guess, are there any current projects that you guys are still researching that you can kind of share?
Yeah, absolutely. We're doing research projects all the time, and they're mainly driven by our TAB board, our technical advisory board. Basically every year they end our meeting with the recommendations, and usually one of those recommendations is we want you to learn more about this. So most recently it was Jamestown Canyon virus, which is kind of a new disease that's cropping up really in our area. And so we did a massive study last year, and we're continuing into this year about figuring out where spring 80s species are popping up, which carry Jamestown Canyon, and to figure out what habitats are most likely to, spring 80s are found all over, but we're only finding Jamestown Canyon in certain areas. So why is it over there? So our lab is doing a study right there, right with that. And then we're also, Rusty Patch Bumblebee continues to be something that is brought up. So we're continuing to work with the Fish and Wildlife Service to make sure that we're being as safe as possible with them. And that's another study that we're contributing to. I did see a question come up from the chat. It says, when do the larvicide treatments begin? Soon, I suspect. They will begin soon. We have started some of our briquette treatments, which is for the cattail mosquitoes, because those we actually find where they are in the fall when they hatch. So we know going into the spring where they are. And so we kind of determine the best way to treat. So we've put some briquettes down in the winter and early spring to find out where those are going to be. Our helicopter treatments are going to begin probably the first week in May. It's been a cold spring, so everything's kind of a little bit delayed. We have kind of a temperature chart that we look at. And so we will probably begin our helicopter treatments around the beginning of May is likely when that'll begin.
Another question, and this is more this past year and these past couple years with the pandemic, we've kind of seen a lot of new invasive species in a lot of different areas, including like jumping worms, or like there was the, murder hornets kind of stuff. Is there you mentioned that there are 52 species of mosquitoes found here in Minnesota. Is there a possibility of finding invasive species? And really, is it more so that they just can't survive here, or are you guys monitoring for that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's always a risk. There's actually one species that we're most concerned about. It's Aedes albopictus, and it's a concern for us because it could potentially carry Zika and dengue fever. It's not typically found here, but we do find a couple every year because they come up during the summer month from like a tire transportation or something like that. But they can't survive our winters, so our climate does protect us. But sometimes we have warmer winters, we're likely to see more mosquitoes surviving in this far north climate that we don't typically see. So we're definitely concerned about the potential for more species coming in and establishing here that aren't native.
Thank you. Another question. You went through some of the examples of diseases and, who are the hosts and the vector species. And you mentioned, for example, West Nile virus, that if a mosquito bites a bird that's carrying it, it can then, if it then bites us, we can transfer it. Is there any way to test birds or horses or these creatures that are hosts or vectors for these diseases? Is there any way to test for that, or is it just kind of luck?
Yeah, no, actually we did used to test birds, dead birds. So we used to be, people would call us when they had dead birds and we would come collect them and then test them. We don't do that anymore. We work with the Department of Health, and now we just focus on testing the mosquito pools that we collect. We still encourage people to call us if they're finding dead birds, especially if there's no clear evidence of trauma, like hitting a window or a car or something like that, because it's very likely it's some sort of disease, possibly mosquito-borne disease. And so we still like to know where those are happening. Especially, it's usually August, early August is when we start hearing those. And that's usually when we know it's West Nile virus. But we don't test those anymore. If the Department of Health recommends that we start doing that again, we could. But I think we got too many people got grossed out by all the dead birds we had sitting around in St. Paul that we had to stop doing that.
Yeah, I imagine that might not be the easiest thing to talk about or to explain to people, but I mean, it's for a good cause,
Yeah.
I would think. That makes sense. I had kind of just a fun little question. Is there a mosquito fact that you really enjoy sharing, or something cool that you find about them?
Well, when I ask this question to our lab, they always talk about like some of their favorite mosquitoes to catch are the ones that don't bite humans. Just because there's some really interesting mosquito species that we find, and there's one species that they always collect a couple of. They're not really attracted to our traps, but they always end up with a couple each summer. And they're like this iridescent blue species. So when you look at it under the microscope, they're like, they got like these glowing blue wings, and they're really like kind of impressive to look at. You don't really think of mosquitoes as being beautiful, but they're really kind of cool. And so that's just kind of a fun thing, to just knowing that there's so many species out there that aren't the ones that are typically around people. It's just kind of a cool fact.
That's really cool.
So follow up for the mosquitoes that don't bite humans, I would assume they're not attracted to humans either, like for the sense and
Yeah, they're not attracted to necessarily to our CO2 or to our breathing and sense and stuff like that. Yeah, they're more attracted to what birds are doing, the smells that birds have, or that particular species actually bites frogs and slugs, which is, yeah, kind of unique. So they're found around water. Yeah.
And so a few years back, this isn't as much to do with Minnesota, but I remember all the talk about Zika, and then seeming like I haven't heard about it since.
Yeah.
Was that just a really unusual spike here, or what's happening?
Yeah, it was. It was an unusual spike here, and there haven't been any cases that were contracted in the US since 2016. There's a couple cases for people get from traveling internationally. But I think part of it was the species that carries it was really easy to identify. So a lot of, departments of health in certain states really did a good job of mitigating the risk. And then also it's just, we see a lot of, ups and downs with mosquito-borne diseases, especially when they're vector-based. So like in Minnesota, we'll see a drop in West Nile because the birds become immune to it. They develop an immunity over a certain amount of time. So they're not carrying it as much. So mosquitoes aren't getting it as much. So part of it is that. So it could be that, Zika could come back at some point, but it doesn't seem that likely. It's kind of hard to predict.
And is it, I would then in other countries still have the same type of flow?
Yeah, kind of really like, I think they said 2/3 of the world population lives at daily risk of a mosquito-borne disease. And some parts of, especially tropical climates, they're at daily risk of serious mosquito-borne illnesses like malaria and dengue fever. So that's why there's a lot of good work being done by NGOs and stuff like that to distribute bed nets and to do kind of mosquito mitigation measures in areas that are really at risk of some of the more dangerous diseases that we don't necessarily see in Minnesota because we have a climate that doesn't allow them to flourish here. We get the question too every year, like when we have those really cold winters or really cold days, like, is this going to kill off the mosquito eggs that are down there? Like, well, we've had cold winters for a long time in Minnesota and they still keep coming back. So not quite.
That kind of goes into my next question. So with this drought that we had last year, are you guys expecting like a huge influx? Or I guess it really depends on the weather, but
Yeah.
do you guys have expectations for the
Yeah.
summer?
That's the other question we get the most. What's our mosquito forecast? And ultimately predicting mosquitoes is predicting the weather. So like it really depends on the rain, but a couple things that we can look at. We actually have a pretty good model that can predict cattail mosquito emergence. Because they lay their eggs in the fall and then overwinter as larvae, we can kind of figure out where they are and then also look at the forecast for the estimated rain amounts and what we had for rain at the end of last year. And so we're predicting actually fewer cattail mosquitoes this year than we even had last year. So we're probably usually, if you look at kind of the chart throughout the summer, usually around the 4th of July, you see the big spike because that's when all the cattail mosquitoes come out. So we're probably not going to see that spike this year. The other thing we look at is the long-term climate forecast on precipitation. And right now they are predicting that we're going to be slightly below average for precipitation. So if that holds true, then we'll see fewer mosquitoes. But predictions can be wrong when it comes to rain and stuff like that. We've already had a pretty wet spring. So it could be that we see a lot more precipitation this year and then mosquitoes are back. But it's really hard to say as far as that goes.
I do have another question. You went over at the end tips to protect yourself and protect your home. You talked about some natural, deterrents. I mean, at least I know growing up, we always had like the mosquito zappers and things that we would hang from trees. Are those beneficial or helpful at all? Or is, I mean, because I know the main thing is getting rid of standing water, but is it fine to have those out or is that not as, are those
I
not
think
used?
you really have to kind of do your own research and figure out because there's a lot of mosquito traps will actually, they emit CO2 and so they'll attract more mosquitoes than they'll catch. And so you're really kind of causing more harm than good by putting those out. So a lot of those that advertise as mosquito traps aren't very effective. The bug zappers, they're not as attracted to light as other insects are. So if you put those out, you'll see it's getting a lot of moths and stuff like that. It's not getting as many mosquitoes. They're more driven by scent than they are by bright lights and stuff like that. So there are some products that have been found to be pretty effective, especially I've heard anecdotally, we haven't done any tests on this itself, but they have some that you can put under a table if you're out and that gives puffs, basically puffs of like a similar product to permethrin that kind of like will keep away any mosquitoes from in a certain area. So you can set those out. They have the citronella candles are somewhat effective. You have to have them pretty close to you though. A lot of people will put them like on the edges of their yard, but mosquitoes can fly high, so they'll go right up and over them. So you have kind of have them right by you. And then we've also seen mixed results with like a lot of people believe that there's certain plants you can put out, but they've done studies on like the like mint and different things you can grow, and really they repel mosquitoes up to like 3 inches. So they're not going to have a huge impact, but there's a lot of stuff out there that some people swear by. So I can encourage people to do kind of your own research and see what's out there and read what entomologists say, because they're kind of the best and final word.
Thank you. I mean, that's kind of all the questions I can think of. Yeah.
Okay, so I was just reading a story in the news about genetic modification
Yes,
and modifying male mosquitoes so that the offspring that were female would die.
yes.
Is that something that's on your radar?
That's not on our radar because they're only doing it with the Aedes aegypti, which is a species that is found in Florida and parts of California and Arizona. So it's not a species that we have here. It's a really interesting study, and they just did it like 2019 or 2020 was the first time they started releasing them. But yeah, the idea is the sterile males will outcompete the other mosquitoes in the area, and then the females won't be able to reproduce, and then it will reduce the numbers. So I think the data is still not official yet on what impact it's having, but it's something we're definitely watching because it could be a cool future for mosquito control to eliminate just a certain species that we don't want. But it's not something we're considering here anytime soon.
Well, I don't see any more questions in the chat, so I guess we'll kind of wrap up. And I want to remind folks that next month, May 18th, our presentation will be on selecting lawn equipment to improve air quality. So we're going to be looking a lot at electronic or battery-powered lawn equipment. So join us for that. That'll, again, just be virtual. So the link is on the website for that, 7 o'clock, May 18th. And folks at home, if you want to give that little clap emoji, GIF, whatever. Otherwise, everyone, let's thank Alex for the presentation.
Appreciate it. Feel free to reach out to me if you have further questions.
Thank you.
Go ahead, stop share.
Yeah, it says sharing.